is really in the context of Paul saying, don't take personal vengeance. Vengeance is God's, so don't do it. You don't have a right to do it. And in fact, on the contrary, he says at the end, if your enemy is hungry or thirsty, then give them what they need. Then he launches into, as we pointed out when we started this, there's some people say, chapter 13 makes no sense. He's a brand new topic. Well, it's not. It's because he's going to be talking about government being the arm of God in taking vengeance on evildoers, which you are not allowed to do personally. And so we're to be subject to the governing authorities. By the way, Mike, I'm going to need my PowerPoint up for Romans. It's in... You know where it is. I've got some slides, extra slides from what I had before. So we're to be subject. That's the key word in this whole section, to the governing authorities, and the fact that the governing authorities, the higher powers, as he's going to refer to them later, have their existence by God. And as I asked last week and the week before in chapter 13, verse 1, who does this apply to? Everyone. Not just talking to Christians here. This is a law of God that applies to everyone. The Greek is pasipsyche. It means every soul, as in the King James Version, or every person, as the New American Standard Bible has. And we talked about as well all of the areas of authority, because that's what he's talking about. He's going to be talking about government, obviously, in verse 1 and verse 3. But there are other areas where God has established authority. Obviously, Christ over the whole world, man over woman, master, boss over slave, employee, in the home, parent over child, husband over wife, in the church, elders over the congregation. And I think that pretty well exhausted all of those. Okay. Yeah, I'll bring that up. You can back that off one, or it's okay. Leave it up there. It doesn't matter. So question 3, which is what we started last week, is where does government get their authority? And the answer is from God. And
that's not going to work for that. He'll have to.
Oh, okay. So, Mike, you're going to have to do that for me as I go along. I will tell you when to do that. And the question is, what happens if we resist that? So, verse 1a, Paul is in the beginning there of verse 1. Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, or the higher powers in the actual literal Greek, for there's no authority except that which God has established. Oh, he's going to fix it for me. And I am leaning towards this idea that the latter part of verse 1 and all of verse 2 is a parenthetical statement, which is what you see up there. Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities. And what's the truth about a parenthetical statement? What can you do? You can take it out and it will still make sense. So if we just read the light yellow, everyone be subject to governing authorities, for rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. In the middle, the end of verse 1 and all of verse 2, is this parenthetical statement where he is talking about authority in general. Up above, it's governing authorities. Now he's talking about any kind of authority. All of the ones that we just talked about from question 2. All of those areas of authority. And so, again, as we pointed out last week, when he says governing authorities, there's not a government, type of government that he specifies there. It could be imperial, monarchy, oligarchy, democracy, or democratic, or a republic. And again, I pointed out that we're not talking about political parties in the United States. We're not talking about Democrats and Republicans. We're talking about democratic government, which is rule of the people, demos, the general population like they had in Athens, or a republican where you have a representative of the people that's going forward and making decisions for that particular small group. And what we have in the United States is a democratic republic. So just that's your political science civics lesson for today. But from verse 1b, the part that's in the bright yellow there, through the end of verse 2, he's now talking not about authorities, but authority, a singular. And so that's how I believe it should be punctuated. And so Paul in this section isn't talking about individual rulers. He's talking about governance in general. And it includes all of those, as we said. And the fact that he starts this with for there is no authority except that which God has established, indicates that Paul is giving the reason why we must submit. Why should I submit? Well, because all valid authority comes from who? From God. And God does, have absolute authority on the basis of what? He's a creator. He's God. And so he can then delegate authority to whomever he chooses. And I gave you the example last week of Matthew 28 and verse 18. Jesus said, all power and authority has been given to me. From who? From God. Okay, so there's delegated authority from God to Christ. And then he's giving that authority to his apostles to go into all the world and preach the gospel. What you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. What you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. And in Matthew 16:19, for instance, where Jesus, after Peter has confessed that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, he said, and on this rock I will build my church, and I will give who? You, Peter, the keys to the kingdom. Okay? Now, some religions think that makes him Pope. And basically, what do you use a key for? To open doors. Who opened the doors to the church in Acts, the 2nd chapter? Peter. Who opened the doors to the church or the kingdom in Acts chapter 10? Peter. And who was he preaching to in Acts chapter 10? Gentiles. So you have Jews and Gentiles. The doors have been opened. Okay? But he goes on further in that text, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Matthew 18:18, he repeats that. And so when he says here, there is no authority except that which God has established, you could read that there is no authority of any kind except that which God has established. I mean, he has all authority, absolute authority. Now, so the last clause of this parenthesis begins in verse 2 where he says, consequently. So, with regard to rebellion against authority of any kind, and obviously, again, the context, the surrounding this parenthesis is government in the first part of verse 1 and all of verse 3. And we talked about this as well. All of you have rebels. Whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted. Some of your translation says whoever resists is resisting. And if I were to ask you, without having told you this last week, or maybe you won't even remember, if I said resist and resisting or rebel and rebelling, what would you think would be the Greek word in both of those cases? You would think they would be the same, and they are not. The English has just translated it so we could, I guess, go with it. The first one, rebel, is antitasso, which means is the opposite of submission. And it's a mental thing. I don't want to submit. That's antitasso. The second one is anthistemi, which means to stand against. And now we're talking about action. So in my mind, I don't want to. In the second one, I'm actually actively rebelling or standing against. I'm taking an active role in that. And so the first one is an attitude, and the second is an action. And the general result is if you rebel, if you do not submit, what's the case there? In verse 2. submit to the authority, whatever authority it is. If I rebel against that authority, whatever the authority is, what's the bottom line of that? I'm rebelling against who? I'm rebelling against God. And so you rebel against your master. Who are you rebelling against? You rebel against your husband. Who are you rebelling against? You rebel against the elders. Who are you rebelling against? I mean, we need to understand this. It's no trifling matter. So if you rebel against authority, the government in this case, as we look at it generally, then you're rebelling against God. Yes, Jonathan? You're going to give me a what if?
No.
Okay, thank you.
I'm just trying to understand if there's a difference between like if you find yourself in a situation where you are unable, you find it difficult, or even to the point where you're unable to submit, is leaving the same as rebelling?
So you're talking about, as in Acts the 5th chapter, where they're telling them not to preach the gospel anymore in the name of Jesus, and they say we must obey God rather than men. Is that the situation you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I get that would be an extreme where I would feel very certain that they were okay and continuing, but I'm just talking about, like, let's say, okay, here's the what if, sorry.
I knew we were going to get there, so I just tried to hurry you along.
You're in a workplace.
Okay.
You can't submit to your boss, not because of any moral thing, but because of just a strong disagreement, and you decide to leave that job and work somewhere else
Okay.
rather than submit. Is that rebelling? Or
No,
is that,
that's just leaving.
that's just leaving?
Yeah.
Okay, that's all I'm trying to understand.
You have that right.
Yeah.
If you don't like the government of the United States, what can you do? You can leave. That's different than going in and at gunpoint telling your boss, I'm not going to do this and I want you to change your policy. That's rebelling.
I feel like it sometimes on those who are unhappy in a situation, this gets used to say you need to stay and submit,
No.
not to say that you can't leave or stay and submit.
You can leave. You could leave a congregation if you didn't like the eldership. But I never see ever an example of that in the Bible.
No.
Okay? Which is kind of interesting to me. Yes?
Are you equating rebellion against God, rebelling and resisting as the same when you talk about rebelling against God? And the reason I ask is because when you use the word resisting, and you explain it as you're taking a stand against something. And for example, if you, whether you're in a workplace or someplace else, and you are required to use certain pronouns regarding people, and we would not do that because that would be a lie for us to say that. So you would be going against that employer, government, whatever. And so in my mind, that would be resisting, because agreeing with that would be going against what God says we are to do regarding that topic.
I don't know that pronouns are mandated by God. I could be talking about Daniel Reeves and call him they. Then they went somewhere, and as I started out class with last week, when you ask me a what if question and you want my opinion, it's worth that. Okay. And with $3 more, you can get coffee at McDonald's. You used to do it at Starbucks, but you can't anymore. I also have to factor in as much as is in me to be at peace with all men. So I don't want to do it just to make a point. But if it's a matter of conscience for you, then I would say leave.
I understand that, and I agree with that part, but to me, like that's, and I understand that we should try to be at peace with all men. However, you are acknowledging something that God speaks against,
right.
No matter what pronoun or word they
Right.
use, and to acknowledge that is contrary to what God says we are
Right.
to do.
Right.
You don't have to make a big stink about it,
Right.
but I do not believe that is rebelling against God in the context of
Right.
how we normally look at
Right.
rebelling against
Right.
God. And that's a very real thing
Oh, I know.
in our world today that we all have to deal
Right.
with.
Yeah. I mean, it's what's politically correct now and socially mandated in some cases. lawfully mandated in some cases. And, again, one of the things I also said last week, all of you have consciences. All of you have to live within what you can do, and applying this to the best of your ability to that. Yes?
I was just going to say, this was why I thought it was a little ridiculous, but I wore masks in public for 4 years because the law mandated
Yeah.
that I do so.
Yeah.
It wasn't something that was commanding me to go against something God said.
Right.
I may not have agreed with it, but, a lot of people are like, oh, come on, that's, they can't make you do that. Well, it is a requirement in this
Yeah.
building. And
Well, and again, that was your conscience. You understood that. That was something that you needed to do. And there's other people out there that didn't have that conscience. And so, and like I said, chapter 14 and 15, we're going to cover conscience in detail. Yes, Debbie?
And I understand what you're saying. Here's the rebel. However, Acts 5:29, we must follow God rather than men. And if, like Terry, if, for example, if she's working a fire, often most of us can't just walk out and say, hey, we're done because God said this. Because most of us can't find another job that is
Right.
the same or pays the same or has the same hours for moms or whatever.
Right.
So that's a very fine line. I
Right.
understand what you're saying, but
Right.
I mean, under no condition do I
Right.
do that.
And this again, I'm just thinking off the top of my head. I could go to that person who is transsexual or whatever and wants to be they, and I could go to them and say, let me say this as kindly as I can. I don't agree with your lifestyle or what you are practicing, but it's not gonna. So when I say they, understand that I'm doing that as a kindness to you and not as a matter of my own belief. It's a really poor example, but when I say the Gospel of John, I don't mean that John's the author of the Gospel, as you all are familiar with. But I still use it that. I don't change it. So again, I know all of this, which is why Paul doesn't get a pile of what ifs, because if he did, you wouldn't be able to carry your Bible around. You wouldn't be able to carry the book of Romans around. And so what I'm trying to give you is the general principles upon which you can make your decisions. And the general principle is that when you defy a God-given authority, source of authority, you are in essence rebelling against him. John?
Something that helps me, I guess, navigate this in my mind is I think of Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego when they were taken into captivity along with all of Israel, and we see where they went in line with the Babylonian rule, and where they drew the line for
Right.
themselves, and how they drew the line.
Right.
And they didn't actively like we can't do this. We need to rise up and fight back. It was
Right.
we're going to stand by our morals.
Well, and even with the food in the first chapter, they went to the steward and said, listen, we have a problem eating this. Just test us. Let's have what we want. And the implication was if we don't look healthier and aren't better off, then we might comply. I'm sure that's how the steward looked at it.
Yeah.
Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they just defied him. No, we are not going to, because that's, God said, don't bow down to idols. We're not going to do that. And they were very upfront about that.
Yes.
When Darius said, no praying to anybody but me, and he was tricked into doing that, it's not like Daniel went out into the square of the city and started praying. What did he do?
Continue to practice.
In his own room, just opened the windows, and the only reason he was caught was because the guys who formulated this whole plan were looking for a way to get rid of him. But he still did it, but he didn't flaunt it.
Yeah.
Okay? Yes.
So a moral conflict is not defying God.
Pardon me?
A moral conflict is not.
No, if you're in line with God's morals, no. So, as I said before, it's not a trifling matter. What happened to a child if he rebelled against his parents in the Old Testament? When the Jews rebelled against Moses' authority, specifically one of his brothers, another brother, I think was one of his brothers, if my understanding of the genealogy of Amram and Jochebed. That was Moses' parents, right? Whew, pulled that one out. They didn't like what Moses' authority was. They rebelled against him. What happened? The earth opened up and swallowed them. God didn't take that lightly. In fact, when Aaron and Miriam rebelled against his authority, and Miriam was struck with leprosy, that should show that. When the church at Corinth didn't align themselves with Paul's authority, as we just finished, 2 Corinthians, Paul said, when I get there, we'll take care of that. I will not delay. And in fact, some Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 11th chapter weren't submitting to the unity teaching of God in the church, that everybody is alike, there's neither Jew nor Greek, bond or free, male or female, and they were separating themselves from each other in partaking of the Lord's Supper. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, and I think it's verse 30, thought I had written down, verse 30, Paul said, that's the reason some of you are sickly and some are asleep. People were dying struck by God, I believe, because they weren't participating in the Lord's Supper properly. So again, it's not just, we live in a democracy, and so our idea is my word is as good as anybody else's, and I can say what I want about any other level of authority that I want, because we're so used to that kind of a freedom in this country. And what I'm wanting you to, if you don't remember anything else from Romans 13, is that when God has established an authority, wherever it is in relationship to you, you better submit. Yes?
So last week, towards the end of the class, I think I asked a question about, is this referring to, when it says he's established all authorities, is it referring to offices that we then fill with terrible people often?
Right.
Or is it referring to the specific individuals? And since then, I think your response was something like, well, how does it practically make a difference, which is true. But since then, I read a bit more about how there are, strong theological positions on both sides.
Right.
And it's still a little confusing to me, but the thing that has helped me more than anything else is seeing the way the first king was established for the Jews,
Mm-hmm.
and how it was very clear that was a sign that they had ultimately rejected
Right.
God in seeking human authority.
Right.
And yet, somehow by the grace of God, he decided to give them this authority. And he even warned them that this is how it's going to go down.
Right.
They're going to tax you to death. They're going
Right.
to abuse you. They're going to do all this kind of stuff. But at the same time, if you respect them, I will bless you as a nation. And so, yeah, it's very difficult, but I feel like it's very relevant to today, where, yes, in some ways we have rejected God by setting ourselves up with these republics and these forms of government. On the other hand, God says, because you've done that, I will use this system to govern you,
Right.
and so you have to respect those authorities.
Right.
It's like
I've empowered whoever you wanted now to be your governor or government, and so you need to submit to them like you were submitting to me. God hasn't removed himself. Even though as when Samuel's complaining about it, God said, they haven't rejected you, they've rejected me. Listen, because you've rejected God doesn't mean God says, oh, I'm going home and I'm done with you. No, you still have to deal with God. So, if you don't, you bring judgment on yourself. The word here obviously connotes something negative, punishment or condemnation, and that's coming from God. And that judgment from God could have reference to the final judgment, or it could have reference to the rulers that have been established over you, being God's servant to deal with that. So I think, are you controlling it?
You're pointing to.
No, I didn't turn it on. I went the wrong direction.
And it's.
Okay, so here's the literal translation from the literal standard translation. Let every soul be subject to the higher authorities, for there is no authority except God. Then the red things would be the parenthetical, and the authorities existing are appointed by God, so that he who is setting himself against the authority has resisted against God's ordinance, and those resisting will receive judgment to themselves. For those ruling are not a terror to the good works, now we're back to the government, but to the evil. And do you wish to not be afraid of authority, be doing that which is good, and you will have praise from it. And then this is Smith's literal translation, let every soul be placed under the protecting powers, and that's placing yourself under submission. For there's no power except from God, and the powers were ordered by God, so he opposing the power has resisted the arrangement of God, and they have resisted they having resisted shall receive to themselves judgment. For rulers are not the terror of good works, but of evil. And wilt thou not fear the power to do good, and thou shalt have approbation of it. So those are the two literal translations of that. And so back in verse 3, then Paul is returning back and talking about rulers. So why should we submit to them? Well, 1b and 2 gives us that because the authority they have resides in God, and God gave them that. And failure of submitting will mean you'll have to answer to God for that. And in verse 3, though, where we're at now, he gives a more pragmatic or practical reason for obeying the governors or government, and what's that? Yeah, you will be you won't be punished. If you do not submit to the governing authorities, you're going to be punished by that governing authority. But if you do, then you won't. Okay? And he goes on and says, rulers are not a terror. They are not to strike fear, not a cause of fear. The word for terror here is phobos, of which you all are familiar with phobias and all kinds of phobias that exist. And so the fear here is that of punishment. They are not a source of terror to good works. That's the principle. Now, let me quickly add that that's not the rule or the case in every situation. You have evil governments. Again, who's reigning when Paul writes this? Nero. And what's he doing? Well, he's lighting up Christians, dipping them in oil and lighting them on fire to illuminate his garden parties. Okay? The two times I was over in China, and the first time was even worse than the second because we had to be so much more secretive about our gathering and our prayer and our Bible study and all of that. But I never understood, from a pragmatic point of view, the reason the Chinese government was opposed to faith in Jesus Christ. Because what kind of citizens would Chinese Christians be? Good. They would submit. They would submit to their government. They would obey. They would be the very best citizens China ever had. The problem with the mindset of the Chinese government and of that communistic viewpoint is they didn't want anybody higher than them. No personage. And that includes God. And so they denied that. And I'll just share this again. My ideal form of government is a beneficent dictator. A loving, kind dictator.
And you mentioned going to China, and I've always thought it was funny, but in my Bible it says printed in China.
Yeah. Well, that's an economic thing for them. Okay. So the ideal principle is that a government will be a terror only to those who do wrong, only those who do evil, and they will uphold justice by protecting those who are law-abiding, those who are righteous citizens. And that's their divine mandate. That's the reason God created government, as we just read. And the point is, anyone who's contemplating doing evil, knowing that the government is back here as God's arm of justice and punishment, will refrain from doing the evil in the first place. Listen, the legal system as God designed it is based on the principle of deterrence. Okay, I've got several passages here. that I want people to read. Deuteronomy 13. I've got two verses, or actually 3 verses there. I need somebody else to turn to Deuteronomy 17. I'll give you 2 verses there. Another one in Deuteronomy 19. And then another one in Deuteronomy 21. So all of these passages are in Deuteronomy. So if you open your Bibles and you want to read them as we go along. So Deuteronomy 13:6. Who has the 13? Okay, Sam.
13:6 from the English Standard Version. If your brother, the son of your mother, or your son, or your daughter, or the wife you embrace, or your friend who is as your own soul entices you, secretly saying, "Let us go and serve other gods," which neither you nor your fathers have known.
Okay, so if that's the case, I don't care how close a relative is, if they're trying to entice you to go and worship an idol, now read verse 9.
But you shall kill him. Your hand shall be first against him to put him to death, and afterward the hand of all the people.
Okay, and then verse 11.
And all Israel shall fear, and never again do any such wickedness as this among you.
Okay, so here's a guy who says, let's go worship Baal. They've got great meals over at Baal, and there's all kinds of things we can do with Baal that we can't do with Yahweh. And so when you find out about that, then the next thing that you do, the first words out of the box in verse 9 is, you shall kill him. And the reason that you kill him is verse 13, which is, then all Israel will hear, and nobody else will get that idea. That's nothing but deterrence. Who has Deuteronomy 17? Okay, I need you to read verses 12 through 13.
Anyone who shows contempt for the judge or for the priest who stands ministering there to the Lord your God, is to be put to death. You must purge the evil from Israel.
Okay, so the judge or the priest, how would you classify those two people? Holders of authority. If you do bad to them, then you're going to die. Okay, that's God's judgment. Deuteronomy chapter 19, verses 15 through 20. Okay, Tim?
15. A single witness shall not suffice against a person for any crime or for any wrong in connection with any offense that he has committed. Only if on the evidence of 2 witnesses or of 3 witnesses shall a charge be established. If a malicious witness arises to accuse a person of wrongdoing, then both parties to the dispute shall appear before the Lord, before the priest and the judges who are in office in those days. The judges shall inquire diligently, and if the witness is a false witness and has accused his brother falsely, then you shall do to him as he had meant to do to his brother. So you shall purge the evil from your midst, and the rest shall hear and fear, and shall never again commit any such evil among you.
Okay, so you bring a false lawsuit against your brother. Maybe it's monetary. Maybe you're making a charge that he committed some sort of capital crime. And so then it goes before the judges. And when the Lord determines that this guy's a false witness, then he pays the money he was seeking from the person he's suing. Or if he was seeking a death penalty, what happens to him? He will die. And again, so that nobody else will do that. And then the final one we already mentioned, but we'll read it, Deuteronomy 21. Who has 21? Okay, Randy, 18 through 21.
If a man has a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey the voice of his father or the voice of his mother, and when they have chastened him, will not heed them, then his father and his mother shall take hold of him and bring him out to the elders of his city, to the gate of his city. And they shall say to the elders of his city, "This son of ours is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey our voice. He is a glutton and a drunkard." Then all the men of his city shall stone him to death with stones. So you shall put away the evil from among you, and all Israel shall hear and fear.
Okay. So, the point of all of those, and it's specified, is the deterrence factor. You do this so that nobody else will. And I've heard that argument made about capital punishment, which we'll get into in a little bit, that it's not a deterrence. Well, number one, it's a deterrent to the guy that killed the person. He's not going to be killing anybody else. Okay? But it's also a deterrent to anybody else thinking about it. You'd have to give a second thought. If I kill this person, I could die. Okay? So now in verse 3, Paul switches to the second person singular. For rulers hold not terror for those who do not right, for those who do not wrong. Now he gets specific. Do you want to be free from the fear of the one in authority? So now he's making it very personal. Do you? Not just out here in some generality of the crowd of faceless people and their authority and their submission to authority. Do you want to live without fear? You yourself. Then what do? What's he say? Do what is right. Do what is right. And do what is good. And in this particular case, I think it has to do with laws of government, doing good in the idea of respecting the rights of others and obeying the laws of the land. It's not talking about going to church every Sunday. That's doing good too, but that's not under consideration here. So living in a way that does not interfere with the rights of others. And so instead of fear of the government, when you do that, what might you expect according to the verse? Yeah, approval, approbation, praise from the government. And I don't know how often that happens. I don't ever get pulled over by a policeman on the highway saying, "Thank you so much for going speed limit." In fact, if the lights came on and pulled me over, I'd think, "Oh no, what did I do?" So I'm very happy that they don't do that. So the main point here, I think the obvious truths here, is that as a citizen, you have two options. You can submit and obey, or you can rebel and disobey. And the civil government operates on the same two principles. They're the same two principles that God operates on with regards to this law. If you keep the commandments, you will escape the penalty and perhaps receive praise. And if you break the commandments, you're going to suffer the penalty. And Paul's going to elaborate on both of those in the next couple of verses. We're not going to get through it, but let's go ahead and read them, verses 4 and 5. For the one in authority is God's servant for your good. And if you do wrong, be afraid. For rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath, to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Therefore, it is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but also as a matter of conscience. So Paul, in the you here, is at least initially here, talking still to this law-abiding citizen. The one he's saying, if you don't want to fear the right, then do good. And so, for the one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you, even still talking about that, if you, and again, this doesn't refer to a child of God. This is anybody. It's a human being. And government here is referred to as he. He's the minister, the servant. The Greek word is diakonos, which we always translate when we see it in the New Testament. We think of deacons. But this is a common Greek word for a government officer, a government official, someone who serves a civil authority. And they're not just servants of the people. In this case, they are servants of God. And they're servants of God, I asked you before, and why are they servants of God? Yes, because God appointed them to do that service. Their authority is established by God. And the purpose is for the good of you law-abiding citizens. But now, if you do wrong, now we're talking to the law breakers, but again, still uses the you to have people think about it personally. Listen, the first appeal that he made to the people was what? It's fear. The whole idea that they could punish you. Are you planning? Are you anticipating breaking the law, of standing against it, then be afraid of the government. Tim, you had a question or a comment.
I was just thinking of Paul, if he could have been a dead man long before he did. The Jews brought false charges and stuff, but there he was in a Roman tribunal,
Right.
and said, look, you proved that there's nothing to these charges, I appeal to Caesar because he was a Roman citizen.
Right.
So he's there glad that there's a government
Right.
that's going to help him.
Right. He's going to appeal to that authority. That's a good point. So, the next statement there is a statement of fact. He, God's minister, servant, does not bear the sword in vain. And outside the New Testament, this word is machera, M-A-C-H-A-I-R-A, and it refers to a wide variety of knives, daggers, swords, long and short. In the New Testament, it's a weapon of violence and death. I'll show you these slides because we're out of time. I'm going the wrong direction, sorry. So these are some statues. The first two are Caesar's, and they both have swords. This, let me see, this sword is right here in his hand. It's a little short sword. This is a little longer sword that's hanging down his side. Here's George Washington. What's he got in his hand? He's got a sword. So we understand the picture of a sword being a symbol of authority. Okay? And we'll look at these passages in the New Testament in 2 weeks. I won't be here next Sunday, so you have a couple of weeks to chew on what we've talked about and what it means to bear the sword. Okay? Any other comments quickly? All right, thank you very much.
Dan, probably don't have to, but I'm going to turn it off just to save battery.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for letting me know.
Where it goes, yeah.
What is that? So small.